Adekunle shook his head, frustration still gnawing at him. It's not just a setback, Morayo. Kehinde knew exactly how to strike at us. He turned Ronke against me. He poisoned her mind. She thinks I'm just like my father, that I'm using her the way Olamaide used women in the past. And Durojaye, Kehinde made him believe Aminat was being manipulated. Folak stepped closer, her eyes locked on Adekunle's. We still have strength, Adekunle. The people still believe in you. Kehinde may have won this round, but his victory is built on lies and fear. That can't last forever. Adekunle met her gaze, finding comfort in her fierce determination. Folak had always been a fighter, and her resolve gave him strength. But the weight of the defeat still pressed down on him. We need a new plan, Adekunle said after a long pause. We need to get ahead of Kehinde. He's not going to stop at just winning the vote. He'll try to consolidate his power now, tighten his grip on the Congress. Tunda finally spoke, his voice low and steady. Kehinde they win because he controls the wealth. As long as the congressmen believe they go, gain more from him, they go stay loyal. We need to weaken that hold. Folak nodded in agreement. We need to show them that Kehinde can't give them everything he promises. His wealth is tied to the slave trade. But if we can disrupt that, if we can cut off the trade routes, sabotage the deals he's making, it'll shake their confidence in him. Morayo added, and we need to rebuild our alliances. There are still people in the village who want to see the slave trade end. We can't let this defeat stop us. We need to reach out to them, show them that there's still hope. Adekunle listened to their suggestions, his mind racing as he pieced together the beginnings of a new plan. They were right. This wasn't the end. It was a setback, but he couldn't allow himself to be defeated so easily. He had made mistakes, yes, but there was still time to turn things around. We'll start with the trade routes, Adekunle said, his voice gaining strength. Kehinde's wealth comes from his control of the slave trade, and if we can disrupt that, we'll undermine his power. Tunda, I'll need you to lead a small group to sabotage the routes he's using. Hit them where it hurts. Tunda nodded, his eyes gleaming with a quiet determination. Consider it done. Folake, Adekunle continued, turning to her, we'll need to strengthen our connections with the merchants and farmers. If we can offer them something better than Kehinde's empty promises, we can start pulling people away from his side. You've built strong relationships in the village. Use them. Folake smiled, a dangerous glint in her eyes. I'll handle it. Kehinde thinks he's won, but he has no idea what's coming. Morayo stepped forward again. And I'll work on the social front. We need to remind the people why the slave trade is harmful to the village. It's not just about money, it's about who we are as a people. Adekunle felt a renewed sense of purpose as he looked at the three people who had stood by him through thick and thin. The defeat still stung, but with Tunda, Folak, and Morayo by his side, he knew that they could still fight back. Kehinde won today, Adekunle said, his voice filled with resolve. But this war is far from over. We'll hit him where it hurts, and we'll show the village that there's a better way. We'll rebuild, and we'll win. His allies nodded in agreement, their loyalty and determination shining through. They had faced setbacks before, and they would face them again. But this defeat would not break them. Together, they would find a way to turn the tide. The village was quiet under the weight of looming tension, but inside Elder Durojayi's home, a storm was brewing. The elder, still reeling from the betrayal he believed his wife had committed with Adekunle, paced back and forth, his mind filled with anger and doubt. Aminat had tried to talk to him about Kehinde's greed, about how the slave trade was a mask for his real wealth. But Durojaye's fury at Adekunle clouded his thoughts. Then, in the midst of his pacing, there was a knock at the door. Aminat glanced toward her husband nervously, knowing who stood on the other side. "Who is it?" Durojaye barked, his voice thick with suspicion. Aminat hesitated before speaking. "It's Adekunle. she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. At the mention of Adekunle's name, Durojaye's face twisted with rage. Without waiting for a response, he stormed to the door and flung it open. There stood Adekunle, his expression calm despite the elder's obvious anger. "What are you doing here?" Durojaye growled, his voice low and dangerous. "After what you did to my wife, I should kill you where you stand." Without waiting for a response, Durojaye lunged toward Adekunle, grabbing him by the collar. The elder's strength, despite his age, was formidable, and Adekunle felt the tightness of the man's grip. But he didn't fight back. He didn't resist. He simply remained silent, staring into Durojaye's eyes with a quiet resolve. "I no go deny or agree to anything," Adekunle finally said, his voice low but steady. "But I'm here for something bigger than that. If you kill me now, you'll never know the truth about Kehinde. I promise you, what I have to show you will change your mind about him." Durojaye's eyes narrowed, but something in Adekunle's tone made him pause. His grip loosened slightly, though the anger still burned hot in his chest. "And why should I trust anything you say?" Durojaye spat. "You think I no fit see through you? You dare use people, just like your father." "You don't have to trust me," Adekunle replied calmly, his eyes never leaving Durojaye's. "You don't even have to like me. But I know Kehinde better than anyone, and what I'll show you will prove that he's been lying to you and to everyone else in this village." Durojaye hesitated, his grip faltering as doubt began to creep into his mind. Could it be true? Could Kehinde, the man he had stood beside for so long, be hiding something from him? Just then, Aminat stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Durojaye, please listen to him. I know you're angry, but this is important. If what Adekunle says is true, you need to see it for yourself." Durojaye turned to his wife, his expression conflicted. His suspicions about her affair with Adekunle still gnawed at him, but there was something in her eyes, a sincerity that made him pause. Finally, he let go of Adekunle and took a step back, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Fine," Durojaye muttered. "But if this is a trick, I'll kill you myself." Adekunle nodded, relieved that the elder was willing to listen, if only for a moment. "I'll take you to the farms. You need to see what Kehinde's been hiding." The journey to the outskirts of the village was long and tense. Adekunle led the way through the thick forest, his pace quick but measured. Durojaye followed close behind, his eyes darting around warily. Aminat walked beside her husband, her face a mask of quiet determination. They finally arrived at a large clearing hidden deep within the trees. Before them stretched acres of fertile farmland filled with crops and resources ready for export. But these were no ordinary village farms. They were secret plots, owned and operated entirely by Kehinde, with none of the profits going to the village. Durojaye's eyes widened as he took in the sight. He had known that Kehinde was wealthy, but this was something else entirely. Rows upon rows of crops, overseen by workers who had no idea that the fruits of their labor were being hoarded by Kehinde alone. "This is where Kehinde's real wealth comes from," Adekunle said quietly, his voice cutting through the elder's shock. "The slave trade is just a cover. He's been telling you that your wealth comes from the trade, but it doesn't. It comes from these farms, these exports. And Kehinde takes 90% of the profits for himself." Durojaye turned to Adekunle, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. "And how you fit know this?" "I've been following Kehinde's movements for months," Adekunle replied. "I know the deals he's made with merchants outside the village. He sells these crops and goods as if they were part of the slave trade, but they're not. They're from our lands, from the resources that belong to the village, but he takes it all for himself, while the rest of us suffer." Aminat placed a hand on her husband's arm, her voice soft but urgent. "Durojaye, this is what I've been trying to tell you. Kehinde has been lying to all of us. You won't lose your wealth if we end the slave trade. Your money is coming from the exports, not the trade. You can still have everything you've worked for, but we need to stop this. Durojaye's mind raced as he processed the information. He had always known that Kehinde was ambitious, but he had never imagined the extent of his greed. All this time, he had been promised wealth and power through the slave trade, but the real profits had been siphoned off by Kehinde in secret. You've been nothing but a pawn to him, Adekunle continued, his voice steady but filled with conviction. He's used you to maintain his control while keeping you in the dark about the true source of his wealth. If you vote to end the trade, you won't lose anything. In fact, you'll gain more because the exports will finally benefit the village, not just Kehinde. Durojaye's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his anger no longer directed at Adekunle, but at Kehinde. He had been played, manipulated into believing that the slave trade was his only path to wealth. But now, standing in front of these secret farms, the truth was laid bare. Kehinde's been lying to me this whole time, Durojaye muttered, his voice thick with bitterness. And I've been helping him. Aminat squeezed his arm gently, her voice filled with quiet strength. You can still make things right, Durojaye. You can vote against the trade and make sure that the wealth of this village is shared by everyone, not just Kehinde. The elder's face hardened with resolve. For the first time in weeks, the doubt that had clouded his mind began to lift. He had been deceived, but now he could see clearly. You're right, Durojaye said, his voice firm. I'll vote to end the trade. Kehinde's time is up. Adekunle nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. He had won over one of Kahinde's most important allies, and the tide was finally starting to turn in his favor. But as they turned to leave the secret farms, Adekunle couldn't shake the feeling that Kehinde wouldn't go down without a fight. The battle for the village was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. It wasn't long after the confrontation with Elder Durojaye that word reached Bizi, the young and striking wife of Chief Ajani, one of Kehinde's most loyal supporters. Bizi had heard the rumors circulating in the village, whispers about Adekunle's growing influence and his ability to sway people, especially women, to his cause. She had also heard about the affair between Adekunle and Aminat, Elder Durojaye's wife. The story intrigued her, but it was more than just curiosity that drove her to act. Bizi had always been ambitious, and while Kehinde and her husband controlled much of the village's wealth, she had grown bored and frustrated. She wanted more power, and she knew that Adekunle might be the key to getting it. Under the guise of supporting the movement to end the slave trade, Bizi reached out to Adekunle, suggesting a meeting at his home. Adekunle, always cautious, agreed, though he could sense that her true intentions might not be purely political. That evening, Bizi arrived at Adekunle's home, dressed in her most seductive attire, a flowing gown that accentuated her curves, with gold jewelry that sparkled in the dim candlelight. She brought wine, a smile playing on her lips as she stepped through the door. Adekunle saw through her immediately. From the moment she entered, he knew why she was really there. Her eyes lingered too long on his body, her movements too deliberate as she poured the wine and handed him a glass. You know why I'm here, Bizi said, her voice smooth, as she set the bottle down and stepped closer to him. Adekunle didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing as he watched her. When she leaned in, trying to kiss him, he gently pushed her back, his voice firm. You're not here to talk about the slave trade, Adekunle said, his tone calm but edged with frustration. You just want pleasure. You don't care about the village or what happens to the people. Bizi's eyes flashed with amusement as she met his gaze, her lips curling into a small smile. Yes, Adekunle, I want you. I want to have my way with you. She stepped closer again, her fingers lightly trailing down his chest. But you need my support. You can't do this without me. If you make me feel like a woman tonight, I'll give you everything you need. I'll convince my husband to vote with you." Adekunle's patience snapped. The weight of the past weeks, the betrayal, the manipulation, the relentless pressure boiled over in that moment. His expression darkened as he grabbed Busy by the arm, pulling her close. His lips crashed against hers, but this wasn't a kiss born of seduction. It was aggression, raw and unfiltered. "You think this is a game?" Adekunle growled, his voice thick with frustration. "You think I'll just use you like that?" Busy gasped, but didn't pull away. Instead, she moaned softly against his lips, surprising him as her body pressed eagerly into his. "Yes, Adekunle," she whispered, her voice filled with a strange mixture of lust and satisfaction. "I want it rough. I want you." Adekunle's grip tightened as he lifted her off her feet and carried her to the bed, his mind racing with anger and desire. He threw her down onto the mattress, watching as Busy's eyes lit up with excitement. She loved every moment of it, loved the way he handled her with both force and control, the way he towered over her as if daring her to resist. Without a word, Adekunle began tearing off her clothes, his movements rough but deliberate. Busy moaned in anticipation, her body trembling as she lay bare before him. Her eyes gleamed with lust as she reached for him, her fingers sliding down his chest as he removed his own clothes. When Adekunle finally lowered himself onto the bed, he gripped her wrists, pinning her arms above her head as his lips trailed down her neck, biting gently at the skin. Busy's breath came in ragged gasps as she squirmed beneath him, her body responding eagerly to every touch, every bite, every kiss. "I'll make you regret this," Adekunle muttered, his voice rough as he kissed her with a savage intensity. But Busy only moaned louder, arching her back as she writhed beneath him. "I love it, Adekunle. Don't stop." He moved roughly, but with a surprising amount of care. He was aggressive, yes, but not reckless. His hands roamed her body with a possessive energy, his lips tracing the curves of her breasts, her waist, before finally moving lower. Busy's gasps turned to cries as his hands gripped her hips, pulling her closer. When he entered her, it was without hesitation, and Busy cried out in pleasure, her legs wrapping around him as she pulled him deeper. Adekunle set a hard, relentless pace, his body moving against hers with a force that made her gasp with each thrust. She clung to him, her nails digging into his back as her body quivered beneath him. Busy's voice was breathless, filled with raw passion. "Adekunle, yes, more, don't stop." He didn't stop. He drove harder, each thrust pushing her closer to the edge. She was screaming now, her body shuddering violently as pleasure overwhelmed her. Adekunle watched as she came undone beneath him, her cries filling the room as she begged for more. "Adekunle, I'll do anything," Busy gasped, her body trembling. "I'll convince him. I'll make my husband vote for you. Just don't stop." Her words only fueled him further, and he kept going, his movements becoming more intense, more demanding. Busy's body responded eagerly, her moans growing louder, more desperate, until she was shaking with pleasure. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Adekunle slowed, his body pressing against hers as he kissed her roughly once more. Busy's breath came in shallow gasps as she lay beneath him, her body spent, but her mind buzzing with satisfaction. She looked up at him, her eyes gleaming with desire and a newfound admiration. "This doesn't have to be a one-time thing," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with promise. "I want more, Adekunle. Give me more, and I'll give you everything you want." Adekunle remained silent for a moment, staring down at her with a mixture of satisfaction and wariness. He had won her over, yes, but this victory felt more dangerous than any before. Busy was ambitious, dangerously so, and he knew that by taking her into his bed, he had invited an unpredictable element into his plan. But for now, it didn't matter. He had gained another powerful ally, one who could turn Chief Ajani's vote in his favor, and that was all that mattered. As Bisi clung to him, her body still trembling from their encounter, Adekunle knew that the stakes had just been raised once again. The battle for control of the village was far from over, and with each step forward, the risks only grew. The village buzzed with whispers of what was to come. Adekunle's growing influence had sent ripples through Kehinde's once unchallenged control, and the signs of tension were becoming harder to ignore. The congressmen who had once been firmly in Kehinde's pocket were beginning to ask questions. Some were drawn to the idea of ending the slave trade, not out of morality, but out of the promise of new profits from the village's rich resources. Even more unsettling for Kehinde were the cracks forming among his closest allies. The once solid wall of loyalty was beginning to crumble, and Adekunle was the one slowly chipping away at it. Bisi had done exactly as she promised. After her heated encounter with Adekunle, she had returned to her husband, Chief Ajani, and skillfully planted the seeds of doubt. She whispered to him of Kehinde's greed, of the secret wealth he was hoarding for himself, and the opportunities Ajani was missing by staying loyal to Kehinde. Slowly but surely, Chief Ajani began to shift his thinking, opening up to the idea of aligning with Adekunle. However, Bisi's actions were not entirely selfless. She had tasted power in her encounter with Adekunle, and she wanted more. Convincing her husband to support Adekunle wasn't just about ending the slave trade. It was about positioning herself to wield even greater influence in the village's future. Meanwhile, Elder Durojaye, after his private confrontation with Adekunle, had been quietly investigating Kehinde's secret farms. What he found only confirmed what Adekunle had told him. Kehinde was skimming off far more profits than he disclosed, and most of the wealth the village believed came from the slave trade was actually from the resources being exported under the radar. Durojaye's suspicions grew, and while he had not yet openly declared his support for Adekunle, he had become increasingly critical of Kehinde's leadership. The elder's words carried weight, and his quiet dissent began to spread through the village's inner circles. Kehinde, however, was no fool. He could sense that his control was slipping, and he had heard rumors of Adekunle's meetings with key figures in the village. But what disturbed him most was the subtle shift in the way people spoke to him, less deference, more questioning. And from those who remained loyal, there was a rising sense of unease. One evening, as Kahinda sat in his private chambers, one of his most trusted guards approached, his face pale. "Master," the guard said, bowing low, "I've been hearing things, whispers from the people. They say Adekunle is meeting with some of the congressmen in secret. They say he's promising them wealth, more than you've given them." Kehinda's jaw tightened. He had expected resistance from Adekunle, but the thought of his half-brother undermining him so directly made his blood boil. "Who's been talking?" Kehinda asked, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't know the full details yet," the guard stammered, "but Chief Ajani's name has come up more than once. His wife, Bisi, has been meeting with Adekunle." Kehinda's eyes flashed with fury. Bisi. He had always known the young woman was ambitious, but to think she would betray him and drag her husband with her was intolerable. "I want you to keep an eye on Ajani and his wife," Kehinde growled, "and find out everything you can about these secret meetings." The guard nodded quickly, disappearing into the shadows as Kehinda sat back, his mind racing. He had underestimated Adekunle's influence over the women of the village, and it was costing him dearly. But he wouldn't be caught off guard again. As the days passed, the tension in the village grew. The cracks in Kehinda's wall of power became more visible, though not yet wide enough for him to lose control entirely. People were still afraid of what Kehinde could do if he suspected disloyalty. But the whispers grew louder, and more people began to quietly consider the possibility of a future without the slave trade. In the midst of this growing unrest, Adekunle worked tirelessly. Every day brought new opportunities to sway those who had previously been out of his reach. He knew the village was at a tipping point, but tipping it fully in his favor would require one final, decisive move. One evening, he gathered with his closest allies, Tunde, the quiet hunter, Folak, his fierce and loyal lover, and Morayo, his calm, thoughtful half-sister. "We're close," Adekunle said, his voice steady but determined. "Kehinde's losing his grip, but we need to act before he regains control. If we can sway a few more key votes, we can end the trade for good." Tunde nodded, his face grim. "But Kehinde still has many loyal to him. They won't turn unless we give them something better." "We will," Adekunle replied. "Once the trade is gone, we'll shift the village's focus to exports. We'll create new wealth, and we'll distribute it fairly. But first, we need to convince them that Kehinde's promises are lies." Folak leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with determination. "BC's done her part. Ajani's already wavering. But Kehinde's watching them now. We need to act fast before he turns them back to his side." Adekunle nodded. "I'll meet with Chief Ajani again tomorrow. If we can secure his vote, others will follow." Morayo, always the voice of reason, spoke up. "But be careful, Adekunle. Kehinde is not going to let this go without a fight. He'll come for you the moment he feels threatened." Adekunle smiled, though his eyes held a shadow of concern. "I know, but this is our only chance. The cracks in Kehinde's wall are growing. We just need to push harder, and it will all come crashing down." The day had finally arrived. The village congress was set to make its final decision on the slave trade. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with uncertainty and whispers of betrayal. Both Kehinde and Adekunle knew that everything they had fought for would be decided today. The stakes had never been higher. As the village square filled with Congress members, elders, and villagers eager to witness the vote, Adekunle stood at the edge of the gathering, his face calm but his mind racing. He had spent weeks building alliances, convincing key figures to break free from Kehinde's grip. But even with all the careful planning, the outcome was far from certain. Across the square, Kahinda stood surrounded by his most loyal allies, his expression a mask of control. But beneath the surface, he was seething. The cracks in his power had grown deeper than he ever anticipated, and his control over the Congress was slipping. He had no intention of letting Adekunle take what was his, but for the first time, he felt the weight of doubt pressing down on him. The sun hung low in the sky as the congressmen and women took their seats, the tension building with every moment. Chief Ajani sat near the front, his face grim as he exchanged glances with Bisi, who stood behind him. Adekunle's eyes locked with hers for a brief moment, and he saw the flicker of determination in her gaze. She had done her part, and now it was up to him to see the plan through. The village elder, an old and wise figure who had watched the village grow and change over the years, rose to address the gathering. His voice, though worn with age, still commanded respect. "We gather today to decide the future of our village," the elder began, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "For generations, we have relied on the slave trade to maintain our wealth and power. But now, there are those who believe it is time for a change. Today we will vote to determine whether the trade continues or if we turn to new paths." There was a murmur of agreement from the Congress members, though many shifted uneasily in their seats. The weight of the decision before them was not lost on anyone. Kahinda stepped forward first, his voice steady, but filled with calculated confidence. "This village has thrived because of the slave trade. It is our lifeblood. To turn away from it now would be to abandon the very foundation that has made us strong. Do not be swayed by false promises or naive ideas of a better future. The wealth we have comes from the trade, and it will continue to make us rich if we remain strong and united." There was a ripple of applause from Kehinde's loyalists, though it was not as loud or confident as it had once been. The doubt was spreading, and Kehinde could feel it. As Kehinde stepped back, Adekunle moved forward. The crowd fell silent, eager to hear what he had to say. His presence alone commanded attention, and even those who had not yet decided their vote leaned in to listen. "We can be stronger without the slave trade," Adekunle began, his voice clear and powerful. "Kehinde has led you to believe that our wealth comes only from the sale of human lives, but that is a lie. Our true wealth lies in the land, in the resources we already have. We can export crops, goods, and materials, and still thrive without selling our people. The trade is bleeding this village dry, and only a few are benefiting from it. We can change that." The murmurs grew louder, and Adekunle could see the uncertainty in the eyes of many Congress members. He pressed on. "You all know it," Adekunle continued, his gaze sweeping the room. "Look around. Do you see Kehinde suffering? No. He grows richer while the rest of us remain bound to an outdated system. It's time to let go of the past and build a future where everyone shares in the wealth of this village." There was a moment of silence, then a smattering of applause that quickly grew louder. Adekunle's words had struck a chord. The tide was turning. Kehinde's face darkened as he watched the crowd shift. He could feel his control slipping through his fingers, and his mind raced for a way to regain it. Desperation crept into his thoughts. He couldn't afford to lose this vote. If the Congress turned against him now, his power would be shattered. As the Congress members began to prepare for the vote, Chief Ayani stood, drawing the attention of the crowd. His decision would be crucial. He had long been one of Kehinde's most loyal supporters, but now, with BC's influence and Adekunle's promises, he had begun to waver. Ajani's voice was steady, though his eyes flicked toward his wife for a brief moment before he spoke. "I have long supported Kehinde and the slave trade," he began. "But I have come to realize that our future lies not in the past, but in new opportunities. I will be voting to end the trade." A stunned silence followed his words, and then a wave of applause erupted from those in the crowd who supported Adekunle's vision. Kehinde's face was a mask of fury, but he remained silent, his fists clenched at his sides. One by one, the Congress members stood and cast their votes. Some still stood by Kehinde, fearing the consequences of defying him. But others, swayed by Adekunle's vision of a new future, voted to end the trade. As the final votes were tallied, the elder rose once more. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of the decision. "The votes have been counted," he said, pausing for dramatic effect. "The village has spoken. The slave trade will end." A roar of approval erupted from the crowd, the sound of victory washing over the square. Adekunle's heart pounded in his chest as he felt the weight of the moment settle on him. He had done it. The trade was over. But even as the celebrations began, Adekunle knew that this was only the beginning. Kehinde's defeat would not come without a price. There would be retaliation. There always was. The village had taken its first step toward a new future, but the road ahead would be treacherous. From across the square, Kehinde's eyes met Adekunle's. They were filled with fury, but behind the anger was something else, determination. This was not over, not yet. As the villagers cheered and the Congress members shook hands, Adekunle felt a sense of both triumph and foreboding. He had won the vote, but the battle for control of the village was far from over. The cracks in the wall had widened, and now the real war for the future of the village would begin. The village had spoken, and the slave trade was no more. The echoes of the final vote still reverberated through the village, but the dust had not yet settled. For many, it was a day of celebration, a turning point toward a new future. But for Kehinde, it was the beginning of the end. In the days following the vote, Kehinde's power began to crumble. The Congress members who had once stood by his side began to distance themselves, fearing the repercussions of being aligned with a man whose influence was waning. His promises of wealth, bolstered by the slave trade, now rang hollow, and the cracks in his once impenetrable wall of control were growing wider by the day. Kahinda, however, refused to accept defeat. He spent every waking moment plotting his next move, meeting with his remaining loyalists, and trying to regain the support he had lost. But no matter how hard he fought, the tide had already turned. Adekunle, meanwhile, was rising. With the slave trade abolished, he had delivered on his promise to the village, and the people rallied behind him. Merchants, farmers, and Congress members alike saw in Adekunle a new leader, someone who could guide the village into a prosperous future, free from the chains of its past. Yet, despite his growing influence, Adekunle knew that Kehinde was far from finished. He had seen the fury in Kehinde's eyes after the vote, and he knew that his half-brother would not go down without a fight. Late one night, Kehinde called a secret meeting with his most loyal allies. They gathered in the shadowy corners of his compound, their faces tense as they listened to him speak. "I won't let this village fall into Adekunle's hands," Kehinde hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "He's not worthy. He's nothing but the son of a slave, and yet he dares to challenge me. This isn't over." One of his loyalists, Elder Sola, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "But Kehinde, the people have already turned against you. The vote, it's final. We can't undo it." Kehinde's eyes blazed with fury. "The vote may have ended the trade, but it hasn't ended me. Adekunle may have won the support of the Congress, but he doesn't have the loyalty of the people. Not yet." He paused, his mind racing. "We still control the farms, the resources. If we can strangle the exports, if we cut off the wealth he promised, Adekunle's support will crumble. The people won't follow a man who can't deliver on his promises." The room fell silent as Kehinda's allies exchanged nervous glances. The plan was dangerous, but desperation had driven them this far. Kehinda's grip on power had always been about wealth and fear, and if they could choke off Adekunle's wealth, they could bring fear back into the equation. While Kehinde schemed, Adekunle was focused on securing the village's future. He knew that simply ending the slave trade wasn't enough. He had to ensure the success of the village's exports to solidify his rise to power. The new trade routes had been established, and the crops and goods from the village's fertile lands were already being sent out to distant markets. But Adekunle wasn't blind to the danger Kehinde posed. He knew his half-brother would try to sabotage his efforts, to regain control by any means necessary. With that in mind, Adekunle moved quickly, strengthening his alliances with key figures in the village and ensuring that the new trade deals were protected. One evening, as Adekunle sat with his closest allies, Tunde, Folak, and Morayo, he outlined his plan to ensure that Kehinde's influence was completely severed. "Kehinde won't stop until he destroys everything we've built," Adekunle said, his voice steady but determined. "But we won't let him. We need to control the farms, the resources, and the wealth that comes from them. If we take that away from him, he'll have nothing left." Folak nodded, her eyes gleaming with fierce determination. "Kehinde's always relied on fear to control the people. If we can show them that they don't need to fear him anymore, that they can thrive without him, he'll lose everything." Tunde, ever the silent strategist, added, "We'll need to be careful. Kehinde is desperate, and desperate men are dangerous. He'll try to sabotage the new trade deals, maybe even attack the farms. We need to be ready." Adekunle nodded. "We will be." It wasn't long before Kehinde made his move. One night, under the cover of darkness, his loyalists struck the village's main export routes, setting fire to the crops and sabotaging the goods that were destined for trade. The damage was significant, and panic began to spread through the village. Kehinde hoped that the people would lose faith in Adekunle. that they would see him as weak and unable to protect their wealth. But Adekunle had anticipated this. He moved quickly, rallying his supporters and organizing a response. With Tunde leading a group of trusted villagers, they were able to contain the fires and secure the remaining goods. The damage was minimized, and within days, the trade routes were restored. The village's response was swift. The people who had once feared Kehinde now saw him for what he truly was, a man clinging to power through destruction and fear. And as the village rallied behind Adekunle, Kehinde's support dwindled further. In a final act of desperation, Kehinde confronted Adekunle in the village square, where a crowd had gathered to witness the fallout of the sabotage. "You think you've won?" Kahinda spat, his eyes wild with fury. "You're nothing, Adekunle. You're the son of a slave, a pretender to power. This village belongs to me." Adekunle stood tall, his gaze steady as he faced his half-brother. "The village belongs to the people, Kehinde, not to you, not anymore." Kehinde lunged at Adekunle, but Tunde and a group of villagers quickly restrained him. The crowd watched in silence as Kehinde, once the most powerful man in the village, was dragged away. His reign of fear and control finally brought to an end. Years had passed since the fall of Kehinde. Under Adekunle's leadership, the village had flourished. The slave trade was a distant memory, replaced by a prosperous system of trade and export that enriched the entire community. The people were at peace, and for the first time in generations, the village thrived without fear of oppression. But even as the village moved forward, there were whispers, rumors carried on the wind, spoken in hushed tones. Some claimed to have seen Kahinda wandering in the shadows, biding his time. Others dismissed it as gossip, believing that Kahinda had fled far away, too ashamed to ever return. Adekunle, now a seasoned leader, had heard these rumors, but gave them little credence. He had defeated Kehinde once, and the village was stronger than ever. Even if Kehinde were to return, there was no way he could reclaim the power he had lost, or so Adekunle thought. One evening, as the sun set and the village prepared for another night of celebration, a figure emerged from the shadows. Cloaked and hooded, he moved quietly through the streets, unnoticed by most, but catching the eyes of those who remembered. His walk, his presence, the unmistakable aura of a man once feared. It was Kehinde. He had returned, but this was not the same Kehinde who had once ruled with an iron fist. His time in exile had hardened him, changed him. He was no longer driven by greed alone. He now craved revenge, and his eyes were set squarely on Adekunle. The village was alive with activity, but Kehinde moved unnoticed, his face hidden beneath the hood of his cloak. He had spent years waiting, planning, and now the time had come to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. As he approached the heart of the village, he saw Adekunle standing on a platform addressing the people. Adekunle spoke with confidence, his voice strong and clear as he discussed the new trade agreements that had been forged with distant lands. The people listened with admiration, their respect for their leader evident in every word. But Kehinde's eyes burned with hatred. He watched as the man who had taken everything from him stood tall, basking in the adoration of the crowd. It was a sight that sickened him to his core. "Look at him," Kehinde muttered under his breath. "He thinks he's won." As the crowd began to disperse, Kehinde moved swiftly, weaving through the people until he stood just behind the platform. His heart pounded as he prepared for his first confrontation with Adekunle in years. He stepped forward, throwing back his hood and revealing his face. The crowd gasped, and a hush fell over the square. "Adekunle!" Kehinde called, his voice dripping with venom. Adekunle froze, his body tensing as he turned to face the voice he had not heard in so long. His eyes widened as he saw the man standing before him, the man he thought was long gone. "Kehinde," Adekunle said, his voice filled with a mix of surprise and caution. "You shouldn't be here." Kehinde's lips curled into a sneer. I have as much right to this village as you do, brother. You may have taken everything from me, but I'm back, and I'm here to reclaim what's mine. The villagers watched in stunned silence as the two brothers faced each other, the tension between them thick and palpable. You were banished, Kehinde, Adekunle replied, his voice steady but firm. The village chose a new path, a path that you tried to destroy. Kehinde laughed bitterly. You think this village is better off without me? You think they can survive without the wealth and power I once gave them? You're a fool, Adekunle, and soon they'll see it too. Kehinde's return was not an act of desperation. It was carefully planned. In the years since his banishment, he had built alliances in the shadows, forging relationships with outside forces who had grown jealous of the village's success. He had spent his time gathering information, learning of weaknesses within the village's trade systems, and preparing to strike when the moment was right. Though the village had prospered under Adekunle, there were those who still harbored resentment, former supporters of Kehinde who had been pushed aside, merchants who felt they were not benefiting enough from the new system, and a few Congress members who had grown tired of Adekunle's leadership. Kehinde wasted no time reaching out to these disgruntled individuals, offering them promises of wealth and power in exchange for their loyalty. Slowly, he began to rebuild his network, planting seeds of doubt and discontent throughout the village. As weeks passed, Adekunle could feel the shift in the air. Kehinde's presence had unsettled the village, and though most remained loyal, there were whispers of dissent. Meetings were held in secret, alliances formed in the shadows, and soon Adekunle realized that his grip on the village was not as secure as it once was. Kehinde, now operating from the fringes of the village, played his cards carefully. He began by sabotaging trade routes, disrupting the flow of goods that had kept the village prosperous. Merchants grew anxious as profits dwindled, and some began to question Adekunle's ability to protect their interests. With each act of sabotage, Kehinde's influence grew stronger. He sowed doubt among the people, telling them that Adekunle's vision of a future without the slave trade had weakened the village, that without Kehinde's leadership, they were vulnerable to outside forces. Tensions reached a boiling point one evening when a group of merchants, emboldened by Kehinde's promises, confronted Adekunle in the village square. They demanded answers, accusing him of failing to protect their wealth and allowing the village to fall into chaos. Adekunle, always calm under pressure, stood his ground. We built this village together, without the need for slavery or fear. The setbacks we face now are the result of those who seek to destroy what we've created. But Kehinde says you've grown weak, one of the merchants spat, that you've led us down a path of ruin. Before Adekunle could respond, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. Kehinde speaks the truth, the voice said, and soon you'll all see it. The crowd parted and Kehinde stepped forward, his face twisted in a triumphant smirk. The villagers watched in silence as the two brothers faced each other once more. This village was stronger under my rule, Kahinda declared, his voice filled with conviction. Adekunle's promises of a better future were lies. He's led you all to ruin, and now it's time for me to take back what's mine. Adekunle's eyes narrowed. You're not here to help this village, Kehinde. You're here for revenge. You've always been driven by greed and power. Kehinde laughed, shaking his head. And what's wrong with that, brother? Power is all that matters. Without it, you're nothing. The tension in the square was thick as the two brothers squared off. Their rivalry reignited with a fury that had been simmering for years. But this time, the villagers were no longer afraid. They had seen what life under Kehinde's rule had been like, and they had experienced the peace and prosperity that Adekunle had brought. Slowly, one by one, they began to stand behind Adekunle, their loyalty clear. You're wrong, Kehinde, Adekunle said, his voice filled with quiet strength. Power isn't what makes a leader. It's the people who choose who they follow, and they've already chosen. Kehinde's smirk faltered as he saw the crowd's support for Adekunle. For the first time, he realized that his return would not be the triumph he had envisioned. The people had spoken, and Kehinde's time was truly over. Kehinde, defeated and without support, was forced to flee once more. This time, there would be no return. His attempts to reclaim power had failed, and the village, united under Adekunle's leadership, was stronger than ever. As Kahinda disappeared into the night, Adekunle stood tall, his eyes focused on the future. The village had weathered the storm, and though the path ahead would not be easy, Adekunle knew that they would face it together, stronger, wiser, and free from the shadow of Kehinde's rule. The golden rays of the setting sun bathed the village in warmth, but inside Adekunle's compound, a different kind of warmth filled the room. Folak sat across from Adekunle, her eyes searching his face. She knew there was something on his mind. His expression was contemplative, as if he were weighing heavy thoughts. After a long pause, Adekunle finally spoke. "Folake," he began, his voice low and sincere. "There is something I've come to understand about myself, and I owe you the truth." Folake leaned forward, sensing the gravity of his words. "What is it, Adekunle?" "I am a man who desires a large family," he said softly. "I want many children, and as much as I love you, I've realized that one woman alone cannot give me the number of children I dream of." He paused, watching her reaction. Folak's expression remained calm, though her eyes darkened slightly with understanding. Adekunle continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've come to accept that I cannot be with only one woman. I need more wives to build the family I want. This is who I am, and I have to embrace it. If you cannot accept this, I will understand, but I want to be honest with you." For a moment, silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. Then, to Adekunle's surprise, Folake smiled, a soft, sad smile, but one filled with love. "Adekunle," she said gently, "I've known you for many years, and I've always seen the fire in you, the ambition. I knew, deep down, that you would one day seek more. And while this is not what I expected, I understand. I love you, and I will stand by your side. Even if you take other wives, I will remain." Relief washed over Adekunle, and he reached out, taking Folek's hand in his. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted to lose you." "You won't," she replied softly. "But I hope you will always remember who stood with you from the beginning." "I will," Adekunle promised. With Folak's support, Adekunle began to act on his desire for a large family. He sought out women who had been widowed during the years of the slave trade, women who had lost their husbands, but still longed for a future. Adekunle offered them stability, respect, and the chance to build a family. His first step was making amends with Madame Ronke, the woman who had played such a key role in his rise to power. He had wronged her in the past, and now, with his newfound clarity, he wanted to make things right. When he arrived at Madame Ronke's home, she greeted him with wary eyes, her posture guarded. "Adekunle," she said coolly, "what brings you here?" "I've come to make amends," Adekunle replied, his voice filled with sincerity. "I used you, Ronke, and I regret that. I want to make things right by marrying you, if you will have me." Ronke's eyes widened in surprise. "Marry me? After everything?" Adekunle nodded. "You deserve better than what I gave you before. I want you by my side as I build this new life." Madame Ronke studied him for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Very well, Adekunle, I'll accept. But know this, I won't be just another wife. I demand respect and equality." "You've always had that," Adekunle replied, smiling. "And you always will." In time, Adekunle married several women, including widows who had lost husbands to the slave trade. He cared for each of them equally, ensuring that they were treated with respect and dignity. His home became a bustling, joyful place filled with wives, children, and the promise of a bright future. But it was his relationship with Folak that remained at the core of his heart. She had stood by him from the beginning, and though he had taken other wives, his bond with her was unshakable. Years passed, and Adekunle's family grew large and prosperous. His influence spread throughout the village, and his legacy as a leader who had transformed the community was well established. Yet, with so many children, the question of who would inherit his leadership loomed large. Among his many sons, one stood out above the rest, Ayotunde, the son of Folake. From a young age, Ayotunde displayed the same qualities that had made Adekunle a great leader: strength, intelligence, and a deep sense of justice. While other children vied for attention, it was Ayotunde who seemed most suited to continue his father's legacy. He was calm under pressure, wise beyond his years, and deeply respected by the people of the village. Adekunle had always known that Ayotunde was special, and now, as he grew older, it became clear that this son was destined for great things. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft glow over the village, Adekunle called Ayotunde to his side. The boy, now a young man, knelt before his father, his eyes filled with admiration. "Ayotunde," Adekunle began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've watched you grow into a man of honor and wisdom. You are my son, and I am proud of the person you've become." Ayotunde looked up at his father, his heart swelling with pride. "Thank you, father. Everything I am, I owe to you and mother." Adekunle smiled, placing a hand on Ayotunde's shoulder. "You are destined for greatness, my son. One day, this village will be yours to lead. You will carry on the legacy I have built, and you will lead with the same strength and fairness that you've shown all your life." "I won't let you down, father," Ayotunde replied, his voice filled with determination. "I will honor your legacy and lead this village with the wisdom you've given me." Adekunle nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. "I know you will. The future of this village is bright, and with you as its leader, it will thrive for generations to come." As father and son stood together, overlooking the village that had grown and flourished under Adekunle's leadership, they both knew that a new era was about to begin. Adekunle's journey was coming to an end, but Ayotunde's was just beginning. And so, with the dawn of a new day on the horizon, the village stood ready to embrace its future, guided by the legacy of Adekunle and the strength of his true heir.